All right, welcome to Severn. My name is Ryan. I'd like to officially welcome you to week 2 of our series from the book of 1 Thessalonians called Unfinished. This week we are in chapter 2, verses 1 through 12, which I'm going to read on the front end before we get into it. It says, "For you yourselves know, brothers, that our visit with you was not without result. On the contrary, after we'd previously suffered and we were treated outrageously in Philippi, as you know, we were emboldened by our God to speak the gospel of God to you in spite of great opposition. For our exhortation didn't come from error or impurity or an intent to deceive. Instead, just as we've been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel, so we speak, not to please men, but rather God who examines our hearts. For we never used flattering speech, as you know, or had greedy motives. God is our witness, and we did not seek glory from people, either from you or from others. Although we could have been a burden as Christ's apostles, instead, we were gentle among you, as a nursing mother nurtures her own children. We cared so much for you that we were pleased to share with you not only the gospel of God, but also our own lives, because you had become dear to us. For you remember our labor and hardship, brothers, working night and day, so that we would not burden any of you. We preached God's gospel to you. You're witnesses, and so is God, of how devoutly, righteously, and blamelessly we conducted ourselves with you believers. As you know, like a father with his own children, we encouraged, comforted, and implored each one of you to walk worthy of God, who calls you into his own kingdom and glory." This is God's word. So Aristotle once said that there is only one way to avoid criticism. Do nothing, say nothing, and be nothing. I've always really loved that quote. And the reason I bring it up is because Paul refused to live that kind of life. Paul chose to do something and to say something and to be something as a follower of Jesus. Only because of his decision to do that, he opened himself up to a world of criticism that he would have been spared of had he not made that decision. And that really is the reality that undergirds this entire text we're looking at today. I mentioned this last week at the start of the series, but you can read in Acts chapter 17 the events surrounding Paul planting the church in Thessalonica. It was a really unique situation because as soon as Paul brought the gospel there, an angry mob formed and they drove him out of the city. They wanted to kill him, and so Paul had to actually run for his life. And as soon as Paul was out of town, that mob turned around and they sought to dismantle Paul's message, really by dismantling and going after his reputation. And what I just read to you is really Paul's response to all of that. So, before we get into this passage, what I'd ask you to do is just to try to make it personal. Meaning, think about the last time, or just a really noteworthy time, that you experienced what Paul experienced here. Think about a time that somebody made up their mind about you without bothering to understand you or to try to get to know you. When they questioned your motives, when they maligned your character, and when they made it their mission to go after your reputation. All right, if that's happened to you, and I'm confident if you've been alive for any length of time, that's happened to all of us. Your parents might have done that to you. Your spouse might have done that to you. Maybe it was people that you thought were your friends or coworkers or what have you. If you've ever walked through that, you know how painful it is, how hurtful and frustrating it is, and how angry it can make you. But I want to share something on kind of a personal note. This is just the way that I operate. Maybe you can relate to this, maybe not. Whenever I experience something like that, where I make a decision that impacts people and people kind of read into my motives or maybe even go after my character or my reputation, just full disclosure here, even though I might never say this out loud, I always take a second because there's always at least part of me that asks, do they have a point? Are they right about me? Because I'm not an expert in self-awareness by any means, but I know enough about myself to know that there's still a lot of me that needs to change. And even though the Bible says that the heart's desperately wicked and deceitful, who can know it? Meaning we don't even know our own hearts. What I do know about my heart is that there are still elements of selfishness in pretty much everything that I do. And maybe you can relate to that. Maybe you can say amen to that because what we all have in common is that like the recipients of this letter, the Thessalonians, we're all unfinished people. But that's what makes Paul's response here so noteworthy to me. Because in verse 10, here's what he says. Verse 10, responding to his critics, he says, "You are witnesses, and so is God, of how devoutly righteously, and blamelessly we conducted ourselves with you believers. Can you imagine being able to respond to your critics with that kind of confidence? Because what that is Paul saying, listen, I have nothing to prove to you, and I have nothing to hide from you. My life speaks for itself. What I read in Paul's words there is a freedom and a confidence and a real deep-seated security in who he was that you can't buy. And so reading that response to the wealth of criticism that Paul walked into really everywhere he went, the first question I have is, how is Paul able to say that? And secondly, how can I become the kind of person that can say it too? So that's what we're going to talk about today. Today, we're going to answer two questions. First off, what does a life that speaks for itself really look like? And then secondly, how can we become the kind of people who can live that kind of life? So first off, what I want to do is look at Paul's life in two parts. We're going to start by looking at what he says about himself in verses 3 through 6, which say this: "For our exhortation didn't come from error or impurity or an intent to deceive. Instead, just as we've been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel, so we speak not to please men, but rather God who examines our hearts. For we never used flattering speech, as you know, or had greedy motives. God is our witness. And we did not seek glory from people, either from you or from others." This is going to bring us to our first idea this morning, is this: a life that speaks for itself has pure motives. Right? Everything that Paul says about himself on the front end of this passage has to do with something below his surface level behavior, something deeper than that. What he's talking about in those verses is the motives that caused him to do what he did at Thessalonica. And the more that I read that, the more it was surprising to me that Paul even felt the need to defend his motives here, because most people would look at Paul's life 2,000 years ago and today and would assume, well, of course a guy like that has pure motives. Because Paul, before he met Jesus, Paul had a really great life ahead of him. He was an up-and-coming, kind of like a rising star in this really prestigious religious school known as the Pharisees, with nothing but, upward mobility and respect and all that kind of stuff. And he walked away from all of that for the sake of Jesus, which caused him to travel around the Roman Empire and experience really some unbelievable persecution for the sake of the gospel, some of which he hints at in this passage. You might have noticed in the front end here on verses 1 and 2, Paul talks about the suffering that he experienced and how he was treated outrageously in Philippi. And what he's referring to there is how he and Silas, just prior to getting to Thessalonica in the city of Philippi, were stripped naked, they were beaten, they were thrown in prison, and they had their feet fastened in the stocks, which was a torture device. So just prior to getting to Thessalonica, Paul experienced, the type of persecution that was not only, physically painful, obviously, but it was also psychologically and emotionally devastating, right? The Roman Empire and the culture of that day was a shame and honor culture. So to be stripped naked in public and beaten in like the city square, that was a form of torture that the Romans devised specifically to demoralize their opponents, to humiliate them, to discourage them from doing whatever behavior they were condemned for. And that's just a snapshot of what Paul experienced. So just, if you pictured what he looked like, if he's stripped naked and beaten in public, this guy's already covered with scars that he will bear for the rest of his life. And that's just one snapshot of all that this guy went through for the sake of Jesus. So I say that to say, most people would look at Paul and assume, well, this guy doesn't need to talk about his motives. Clearly, this guy's genuine. Clearly, the only reason he would do what he's doing is, out of this genuine desire to please God and serve people. But Paul, given his background as a Pharisee, I feel like was an expert in understanding something that we're often blind to in our own lives, which is that it's entirely possible to do all kinds of right things with all kinds of wrong motives. And there's not a story that I've ever heard that illustrates that fact really more clearly than a story that actually Charles Spurgeon used this. It's called The King, the Carrot, and the Horse. It goes like this. So once upon a time, there was a gardener who, walking in his garden one day, discovered that he had somehow managed to grow a carrot unlike any carrot he'd ever grown before. This thing was gigantic. It took 2 hands to hold. And the first thought that came into his mind was, all right, I'm going to give this to the king. So he hoists this carrot onto his wheelbarrow, and he enters the presence of the king with his court there, and he unloads the thing, and he says, King, I'm a gardener. I've been gardening my whole life. I've never seen a carrot like this in my garden. I probably never will again, and I just wanted to give it to you out of appreciation for the kind of king you are. You're not a tyrant. You protect us. You have such wisdom in your decision-making. I don't even know if you like carrots, but here's a giant one that you can eat for a couple of weeks if you really want to. And so he turns to leave, and the king stops him, and he's so moved by this man's generosity that the king says, just hang on 1 second. What is crystal clear to me, the king says, is that you are an amazing steward of the earth. I mean, obviously, you have to be good at your game to be able to produce this kind of granddaddy of all carrots. But not only that, it's clear that you really love what you do. So you might not realize this, but the king said, I actually own a plot of land next to you. I'm going to give it to you for free, just so you can do more of what you love. And the gardener walked out of the king's presence that day, like almost floated home. He was so ecstatic. So overseeing this exchange and overhearing this exchange was a nobleman that stood in the king's presence that day. And so he thought to himself, okay, so if the king just did that for a guy who gave him a large vegetable, then I wonder what the king would give somebody who gave him something valuable. So the next day, this nobleman walks into the presence of the king, same way the gardener did. Only behind him, he's got this beautiful, purebred black stallion. And he walks into the king's presence, and everybody's oohing and ahhing, and he bows real low, a lot of pomp and circumstance. He says, "O king, I have bred horses my entire life. It's a trade that my family's been involved in for generations, and this stallion behind me represents the closest to perfection that you will ever find in an animal. And I'm here today to present this to you, simply out of appreciation for who you are." And so the king looked at the nobleman, and he looked at this stallion, and he looked back at the nobleman, and he said, "Thanks." And that's all he said. And so the nobleman kind of, picked his head up from his bow, waiting for but that never came. And so the king said, let me ask you something. You were here yesterday. You saw that gardener come in, did you not? And the nobleman said, I did. And so the king said, so you're now, no doubt, a little bit confused right now about how this exchange between you and I is going. Are you not? And the nobleman said, I am. And the king said, let me break this down for you. Yesterday when that gardener walked in here, he was giving me that carrot. Today when you walked in here, you were giving yourself that horse. And I've always loved that story because it highlights this principle. It sounds simple, but it's so profound that it's entirely possible to look like you're doing selfless things for entirely self-centered reasons. So what Paul is doing on the front end of this passage is he's just defending his motives. But what's really cool about this, and this is where this passage gets really surgical and causes us to take a look at ourselves, is Paul highlights 3 motives that he says he was completely free from. And in highlighting those 3 motives, what he's doing is he's highlighting really some of the most common ulterior motives that have a grip on the human heart. So I want to read these to you from verses 5 and 6. He says, "For we never used," here's the first one, "flattering speech, as you know, or had," here's the second one, "greedy motives. God is our witness. And we didn't," here's the last one, "seek glory from people, either from you or from others." So what I want to do is just take a minute and walk through these 3 motives Paul said he was free from. So the first he highlights here is something that he calls flattering speech. Now, that doesn't sound like a big deal, right? What's the problem with flattery? You tell somebody they're good looking before you ask them something, no harm, no foul kind of thing. But the Greek word that Paul uses there, I think it's a little bit more powerful than the concept of flattery in the English language portrays. So I'm going to read to you 2 different definitions of the Greek word that's translated flattering speech. Here's the first one. The use of acceptable speech, so it's not even that you're telling a lie, like you could be saying something that's accurate. It's the use of acceptable speech with the purpose of lulling someone into a sense of security so that one may obtain one's own ends. It sounds kind of ugly. Ever done that before? Me neither. Here's the second definition. It says the torturous methods by which one man seeks to gain influence over another, generally for selfish ends. So the desire that Paul is talking about here with flattering speech is the desire for influence. Now, as soon as I came to that understanding of that Greek word, it immediately made me think of a story that a coworker of mine told me back when I was in the old fire department. I only worked a few shifts with this guy. He was a lot older. He had more than 30 years in. He was, I think he only had a year or two left before he retired, actually. But he told me that in his spare time, he actually had enough leave that every time his shift fell on a Sunday, he could take that shift off. And the reason he did that was because he pastored a church over on the Eastern Shore. A small church, about 20 people, and he was the pastor of that church, and really cool guy to work with. Incredibly, like it was just obvious that he was filled with the Spirit of God. One of those guys. And so, he was telling me this story. He said that one time, one of his beloved congregants came up to him and wanted him to do something, wanted him to make a decision, steer the church in a direction, and he said, yeah, I'm not going to do that. And so the guy responds, this is going to sound just like the king, the carrot, and the horse, but it's not. This is a true story, unless this pastor was a liar and had me fooled. I don't think he was. Like I said, filled with the Spirit. So he tells me that this congregant, in response to hearing that the pastor's not going to do what he wants, he says, listen, pastor, I happen to give $20 a week to this church. Yeah, you know where this one's headed. So he says, if you don't do what I'm asking, that $20 is probably going to stay in my pocket instead of the plate. And so the pastor responded to him, and if this does not command my respect, the pastor looked him dead in the eye and he said, God doesn't need your money, keep it. I love that. Because let me just ask you, how ugly would church be if that's how we did things? How long would it be before somebody with a real big personality and a real big paycheck came in here and said, you know what, I don't like the whole exclusivity of Jesus thing. Stop saying that. Here's 10 grand. By the way, I don't like it when people that look like this show up. Here's 20 grand. Like it would take a half hour for the church to be so far from what Jesus designed it to be if the biggest donors got to call the shots instead of Jesus who built the church, right? Like I don't think I have to explain that, but you understand. So the reason I tell the story is because what is crystal clear in the guy's exchange with the pastor is that in giving to the church, he was not giving to the church. His giving to the church was really his attempt to gain influence and power and authority in that church. And that's exactly what Paul's talking about here. That in coming to Thessalonica, he didn't come there just to gain influence with these people. He was free from that motive. The second thing that he highlights is what my translation just says, greedy motives. And that sounds a lot like money is the first thing that comes to mind. And that is what that word can mean, but it also means a lot more than that. What that term really has the connotation of is just a general attitude of an eager seeking for more. So what Paul's talking about is the desire for material possessions in whatever form that takes. And the last thing that Paul says he did not do, he says he was not seeking glory from people. And this one's pretty straightforward. We all know what this is. This is just doing good things so you can look good, so that you can, post about it on Instagram, so that you can get more followers, so that you can get famous, so that you can, get glory. So the three desires that Paul highlights here is the desire, first off, for influence, secondly, for material gain, thirdly, for glory. Or if you're a fan of alliteration, and this might make it a little easier to remember, he's talking about the desire for power, the desire for possessions, and the desire for praise. Now, you hear me say this all the time, but I'm convinced that no detail in the Bible is there arbitrarily. So when I read that, and I read Paul specifically saying, I was not interested in these three things did not have a hold on my heart and drive me as ulterior motives, I am so convinced that the reason Paul specifically pointed out these three motives is because he knew that these three motives tend to have such a unique hold on the human heart. These three desires, the desire for influence or power over others, the desire for material gain compared to others, and the desire for glory or praise from others are the real reason behind so much human activity, even human activity that looks really good and selfless on the surface. And depending on your temperament, your upbringing, your childhood home, things that were given to you or denied you, or some other weird, mysterious collection of things, one of those desires probably has more appeal to you than the others. I actually did a social experiment this week and just asked a few people, out of these three things, power, possessions, praise, what drives you more? What has more of a hold on you? And it was amazing. People answered in different ways. But the question that these verses should ask ourselves, and Paul talking about his motives, is this: why do you do what you do? What's the real reason? And we can have everybody else fooled, right? Like we can put up that, why else would I be doing this if not for you? I knew that it would call all that kind of stuff. What's the real reason that you give, or that you serve, or that you show up, or your morality? And if you don't know the answer to that, here's what I found in my own life. All you really need to do, the next time you go out of your way for somebody and you start experiencing bitterness, just trace that bitterness far enough back into your heart and you will find what your real motive was all along. But the reason this is so important is because according to this text, the first mark of a life that speaks for itself is pure motives. Here's where Paul goes next, verse 7. Real uplifting sermon so far. A lot of chatter out in the stands today. Verse 7 says, although we could have been a burden as Christ's apostles, instead we were gentle among you, as a nursing mother nurtures her own children. We cared so much for you that we were pleased to share with you not only the gospel of God, but also our own lives, because you'd become dear to us. For you remember our labor and hardship, brothers, working night and day so that we would not burden any of you. We preached God's gospel to you. And then hop down to 11. As you know, like a father with his own children, we encouraged, comforted, and implored each one of you to walk worthy of God, who calls you into his own kingdom and glory. This is our second, and it'll actually be our final idea this morning. It's that a life that speaks for itself embodies real change. So on the front half of this passage, Paul talks about his intentions toward the Thessalonians. But Paul knew something, and this passage really shows us something that we're all really wise to remember. It's that intentions that don't translate to actions don't mean anything. It's really what Paul's driving at here. All right, so everyone here, I'm sure, has probably heard something about Hurricane Dorian. A couple of weeks ago, that was really all I was hearing about on social media and things like that, because people were projecting that this was a storm that was basically going to sink the United States. By God's grace, we did not get hit nearly as hard as people were projecting. However, as a lot of you probably know, the Bahamas weren't so lucky. So I saw a lot of footage on Instagram, actually, that was just unbelievable. I saw a video taken from somebody's phone from the second story in their home, looking down into their living room, and the living room was in like 1.5 feet of water. And the couch was just floating and crashing into walls. I saw a video of a grandmother holed up in her bathroom with her grandkids, just calling out to God. It was unbelievable. It was literally the strength, the power of that storm, and what it did to people was heartbreaking. But without fail, when something like Hurricane Dorian hits, the number one response that you hear from politicians, the number one response that you'll see from people on social media, which I've even posted on my Instagram before, the number one response when something like that happens is this: thoughts and prayers. Thoughts and prayers to this people or those people or these survivors or whatever. Thoughts and prayers. And here's something that this passage should cause us to really wrestle with. Right? The Bible certainly says that it's a good thing to think about people who are going through tough times. And it's an even better thing to pray about those people. We're commanded to do those things. But if our thoughts and our prayers don't translate to something more than just thinking and praying, if they don't translate to us actually doing something for the people that God's placed in our life, they don't really mean anything. And if that sounds striking, that's exactly what James said in his New Testament letter, when he said that if we see our brother or sister going without clothes or going without daily food, and all we say when we see that is go in peace and be clothed and keep warm and eat well, but we don't actually help them, James says, then you didn't actually help them. And so what Paul is saying here on the second half of this passage is that his intentions toward the Thessalonians did not remain his intentions. They translated to actions. And what he does is he uses two metaphors to describe the kind of life that he lived, which I think is interesting. He says that he was like both a mother and a father to them. He says, as a mother, he nurtured them and he cared for them just the way that a mom takes care of her newborn baby. That's how Paul invested in those Thessalonians, because that's really the only time that he knew them, just when they were newborn infants in Jesus. And he says, as a father at the end here, he encouraged, he comforted, and he implored them as they were taking their first steps in the faith. So what Paul's point there is, that when he came to the city of Thessalonica, he did not just preach a message to them. He lived that message himself. It was a message that before he asked anybody else to give their life to it, he gave his life to it. Before he expected it to change anybody else, he made sure that it changed him. So the second question that this passage would have us ask ourselves is very simply this: do our actions prove our convictions? So for those of us that have claimed to be followers of Jesus, if you claim to have had an encounter, a life-changing encounter with the love of God as demonstrated to you through Jesus Christ, the question we should ask ourselves is, does that love manifest itself toward the people that God's placed in my life? Does my life prove that I really believe what I say I believe? Has it changed me? Because a life that speaks for itself embodies real change. Now, if I left this teaching today, this to me would be maybe one of the most condemning, not just convicting, but condemning sermons that I've ever delivered. And I say that because when I talk about, pure motives, the only thing that causes me to think about in my life is all the times that I still do things with wrong motives. And it's a frustrating thing when I come face to face with that and I realize, well, I can't change my heart. I can't just decide to be selfless. So it doesn't help me to say, hey, Ryan, you should have pure motives. Great, I got that. I've known that for a really long time. I need something more than that. And when I look at this idea that, a life that speaks for itself embodies real change, all that makes me think about is all the areas in my life where my actions still need to be molded by my convictions. And it makes me think about all the ways that it hasn't yet proven itself in real life, but that I want it to. I'm not there yet. So the question that this passage finally would leave us with, maybe this is the most important question this morning, is how do you become the kind of person that lives that kind of life? If we don't answer that, then this has been an entire waste of time this morning. And we find an answer to that very specific question buried in this text. We've actually already read it. It's right here in verse 4 where Paul says this. He said, just as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel, so we speak, not to please men, but rather God who examines our hearts. I'm talking about a lot of Greek words today. The Greek word that gets translated approved, when Paul says that he knows he's been approved by God, it's a really interesting Greek word because it has a double meaning. What that word means, first and foremost, it means to scrutinize something very carefully. It referred to the way that people in the Roman Empire would scrutinize currency, coins, to see whether or not it was a counterfeit or whether or not it was authentic. It also could be used to describe the way that people would vet a politician, grilling them and asking them questions and keeping a close eye on their life to see whether or not they were a good fit and they were really ready for high-level leadership. That's what that word means. But what that word also means is that after having scrutinized that coin or that politician or anything, to declare it genuine and to deem it worthy. So here's what Paul is saying here, that he knows that God, who examines our hearts, that's an amazing thing in and of itself because you can't even examine your own heart. The Bible teaches that there's all kinds of things going on inside your heart that you will never be able to see and understand. God can see all of it. God understands all of it. He can examine our hearts. And Paul is saying here that God has seen him to the bottom and yet approved of him and accepted him and loved him to the top. That reality, more than anything else in Paul's life, is what changed him and allowed him to live this life that he's putting on display here. So I did a wedding last night for a guy that I've known since 8th grade, which was a really unique experience for me. And when he and his new bride danced at their very first song, the chorus of the song really caught me. I just couldn't shake it because the chorus just repeated the same thing over and over, like every song today. And all it said was this: fully known and loved by you. Fully known and loved by you. What Paul is saying here is that he knows he is fully known. He's been looked at from every angle. He's been analyzed to the bottom, and yet he is totally loved. He has the acceptance, the approval, and the love of his God. And the reason that Paul could have the confidence to say something like that is very simply because he understands the gospel better than we do. In 2 Corinthians chapter 5:21, is the same author, Paul, writing to a different church. Here's what he said. He said, he, being God the Father, made the one who did not know sin, that's Jesus, to be sin for us, so that we might become the righteousness of God in him. The phrasing of that verse has always really spoken to me, because what that verse says is that Jesus did not just take your sin, it says he became your sin. So in Jesus, you don't just receive the righteousness of God, you actually become the righteousness of God. It's a radical change in who you are on a fundamental level. Yeah, I mentioned this during announcements, but last week after the 10 a.m. service, somebody came up to me and he wanted to give his life to Jesus. And so me and him and the guy that invited him brought him into an office, and we prayed, and sure enough, his conversion experience was like the stereotypical, like that's what it's supposed to look like. As soon as he was done praying, he stood up, he couldn't start laughing, he was kind of, we were all getting emotional and hugging it out and all this kind of stuff, but he kept repeating the same thing over and over. This really spoke to me, because he's new to this, so he hasn't even been around long enough to be fake about it. Like he wasn't saying this to, because he knew that this was the right thing to say. This is just the first thing out of his mouth once he had an encounter with Jesus. He kept saying, man, I feel like I'm a different person. I just feel like I'm not the same guy that I was when I walked into this office. I just feel like a different person. And me and Kurt were laughing, and we said, that's because you are. That's exactly what the gospel says. That the moment you give your life to Jesus, you're not a modified version of what you once were. You're a completely new creation. And so what this verse promises all of us who've put our trust in Jesus, and I don't think anybody goes very long without needing to hear this, which is why it's so often stated specifically in the New Testament, that when God looks at you, he does not see somebody that he's disappointed in. He does not see somebody that he's just, why did I save that person? They consistently fail to measure up. They're still not getting it. They're misrepresenting me. What, according to this verse, what God sees when he looks at you in Jesus is his own perfect, sinless righteousness staring him back in the face. And what that means is that you and I, despite the fact that we are so far from the finished product, you and I, at this very moment, because of Jesus, we can have all the confidence that Paul had of knowing that God can examine our hearts all he wants. He can look at us from every angle. He can grill us. He can vet us all he wants. And he will never find anything in us that will cause him to reject us. Not because we've lived really good lives, but because Jesus lived a perfect life for us. And in him, we're a new creation. That's what changed Paul's life. And that reality, more than your own effort, more than a desire to keep up appearances, more than being really afraid of being found out, that will change your life holistically. Your motives, your behaviors, all of who you are more than anything else. And that reality of what God has done for us in Jesus is something that we need to go back to early and often, because that's the fuel that allows us to live a life that speaks for itself. Let me call the worship team up. We're going to close today. I want to end with this quote that I think perfectly captures what I'm trying to say here. It says, the remainder of our earthly life is an outworking of what God has already in-worked. We are called to become what we are. This is the mighty imperative of Christian ethics. Every other ethical system, this is what makes Christianity so unique, and I love pointing this out. Every other ethical system calls us to the costly effort of becoming what we are not, but in the full salvation already bequeathed to us in Christ. The new nature is already ours, waiting for expression, poised for growth until its potential is triggered by our obedience to the Word of God. Now, if this is a message that you feel like you need to respond to because you've given your life to Jesus, but you haven't been living out of that reality, that you've been working for God's approval rather than from it, then we just want to invite you to come forward if you want to talk with somebody or have somebody pray for you. That's what a response team is here for. But as we close, this is the last specific type of person I want to speak to. If you're here today and you don't know that you're right with God, but you hear about this experience that my friend had after the 10 a.m. service 7 days ago, and you want that kind of change, you want that kind of new beginning, you want that kind of peace and that encounter with God, I'm here to tell you, this is the greatest news in the world. You can have it today. All you have to do is what he did 7 days ago, which is put your trust in Jesus. If you want to do that with somebody from our response team, that is the whole reason we exist as a church. I'll close with this. Tim Keller said it best when he said that it is only in the gospel of Jesus Christ that we get the verdict before the performance. We get the verdict before the performance because our Savior stood in the courtroom for us. That'll change your life. That's it. That's all.